The courtroom was silent. Every eye in the room was locked onto the man standing before the judge's bench. His hands trembled as he clutched the edge of the wooden table, his knuckles white with fear. He never thought he would be here. He never thought his game would end this way. But now, standing in front of the judge, he could barely breathe. "State your name," the judge said, his voice firm but calm. The man hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Bobby Larson." The judge's eyes did not waver. "Do you recall harassing a black man on the road a few months ago?" Bobby's heartbeat pounded in his ears. He swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about." A pause. A long, heavy pause. Then, the judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, his dark brown eyes piercing straight through Bobby's soul. "Funny," the judge said, his voice colder than steel. "Because that black man was me." Gasps filled the courtroom. Bobby's legs nearly gave out. His face drained of color. He wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. His own past had caught up with him in the worst way possible. And just like that, the nightmare began. A few months earlier, Bobby Larson adjusted his fake police badge in the mirror of his old, beat-up Ford Crown Victoria. He had ordered the badge online, along with a pair of aviator sunglasses and a cheap security officer uniform that looked close enough to a real cop's. The car was an old police interceptor, one of those retired patrol cars they sold at auctions. He had made a few modifications, flashing lights behind the grille, a police scanner, and even a fake ticket book. To most people, he looked official enough. He had been pulling people over for months now, mostly targeting those he didn't like. People who looked different. He had a twisted sense of power, standing over them, barking orders, making them feel small. Nobody questioned him. He counted on their fear. But today was going to be a special day. As he drove down the highway, he tapped his fingers on the wheel, scanning the road for his next victim. That's when he saw it. A sleek black sedan cruising a few miles over the speed limit. Behind the wheel, a well-dressed black man, looking confident, calm, and in control. Bobby grinned. He hated that look. It made his skin crawl. Flipping on his flashing lights, he sped up behind the car. The driver hesitated for a moment before pulling over to the side of the road. Bobby parked behind him and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he walked up to the driver's window. The man inside lowered the window. "Good afternoon, officer," he said politely. Bobby smirked. "License and registration." The man handed over his documents without hesitation. Bobby barely glanced at them before launching into his usual routine. "You were speeding," Bobby said. 20 miles over the limit." "That's reckless driving." The man frowned slightly. "I believe I was only a few miles over." Bobby slammed a hand on the roof of the car. "Don't argue with me." The man stiffened, gripping the steering wheel. There was something about him. He didn't look scared enough. "Step out of the car," Bobby ordered. The man hesitated. "May I ask why?" "Step out now." Slowly, the man unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped onto the pavement. He was taller than Bobby expected, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit with polished shoes. He looked important. Bobby pulled out his fake ticket book. "You know, I could have your car impounded for this. I could arrest you right now." The man stared at him, unblinking. "What's your badge number?" Bobby scoffed. "Don't you worry about that. What precinct are you from?" Bobby's jaw clenched. "Are you questioning my authority?" "I just want to make sure I know which department to contact about this," the man said smoothly. Something about the way he spoke made Bobby uneasy. He had dealt with enough people to know when someone wasn't easily intimidated. "Just pay the fine," Bobby snapped, tearing off a fake citation from his booklet. The man took the paper, glancing at it. His eyes narrowed. "This isn't real," he said. Bobby felt heat rise in his face. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I'm saying this ticket is fake, and I don't think you're a real cop." Bobby's hand went to his belt, where he kept a cheap plastic baton. "You better watch yourself." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly pulled out his phone and started recording. Bobby froze. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice calm. Bobby's mind raced. He had done this dozens of times, but this was different. This man wasn't scared. He wasn't backing down. His pulse quickened. He had to end this. Now, reaching forward, he grabbed the man's wrist. Give me the phone. That's assault, the man said sharply, pulling away. Bobby's breath came fast and shallow. He had messed up. Big time. Flashing headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer. Bobby's stomach twisted. A real police car. He turned back to the man, who was still recording. You're going to regret this, Bobby growled, before storming back to his car and speeding off before the real cops arrived. He thought that was the end of it. He had no idea his worst nightmare had just begun. Months passed, and Bobby continued his scam, pulling over more people, issuing fake fines, and feeling untouchable. But something had changed. He started noticing cars parked outside his house that he didn't recognize. He saw people staring at him in stores. He received letters in the mail with no return address. He felt like someone was watching him. Then, one evening, it happened. There was a loud knock at his door. He peeked through the window and felt his stomach drop. Police. Real police. Red and blue lights flashed outside his house. A dozen officers stood on his lawn. There was no way out. Bobby's hands shook as he opened the door. Are you Bobby Larson? One of the officers asked. Bobby nodded slowly. You're under arrest for impersonating a police officer, fraud, and multiple counts of harassment. Bobby's legs nearly gave out. Wait, there's a mistake. The officers didn't listen. Cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. They dragged him out of his house, past the flashing lights, past the neighbors watching in stunned silence. His world had just come crashing down, and he had no idea it was only going to get worse, because soon he would face the very man he had harassed on the road, but not as a victim, as a judge. Bobby sat in the back of the police car, his wrists burning from the tight handcuffs. The red and blue lights flashed against the dark street, reflecting in the side mirror. His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He had played this game for months, pulling people over, making them squirm, feeling like he had power. No one had ever fought back, except for that one guy in the suit. That black man. The one who recorded him. The one who wasn't scared. Bobby clenched his jaw. No way this was connected to that. It couldn't be. As the car rolled through the city streets, his thoughts grew darker. He had been careful. No real badge, no real police ID, just a uniform and a tricked-out old cop car. He had made sure his victims were people who wouldn't fight back. The kind who would take the ticket and go. So how had they found him? Where are we going? He asked, his voice hoarse. The officer driving didn't even glance at him. Downtown precinct. You'll be booked and processed. Might want to get comfortable. Bobby swallowed hard. His mouth was dry. Booked and processed. That meant fingerprints. Mugshots. A record. His whole life was about to change. The car turned a corner and pulled up to the precinct, its towering brick walls making Bobby's stomach twist into knots. As the officers pulled him from the car, cameras flashed. Reporters. People pointing. They knew. The world already knew. He lowered his head as he was dragged inside. This wasn't supposed to happen. The next few hours passed in a blur. Mugshot. Fingerprints. Cold steel bars. He was shoved into a holding cell, the door slamming shut behind him. Other men, some rough-looking, some quiet, sat on the hard benches, staring at him. Bobby's hands clenched into fists. He wasn't supposed to be in here with them, but now he was. Minutes turned into hours. Hours stretched into what felt like days. And then, the door opened. Larson, a guard called. You got a lawyer. Bobby stood up quickly, nearly tripping over himself. A lawyer. Finally. Someone who could get him out of this mess. They led him down a hallway into a small, dimly lit meeting room. A man in a gray suit sat at the table, a thick folder in front of him. Bobby dropped into the chair. Tell me you can fix this. The lawyer didn't look impressed. He flipped open the folder and took a deep breath. Fix this, he repeated. Bobby, you are facing multiple counts of impersonating an officer, issuing fraudulent citations, and harassment. Do you understand how serious this is? Bobby scoffed. I didn't hurt anybody. The lawyer's eyes darkened. That's not what your victims are saying. Bobby's stomach flipped. Victims? The lawyer slid a stack of papers across the table. Statements. Videos. Witness accounts. You didn't just harass one or two people, Bobby. We're talking dozens. Bobby's mouth went dry. Now, the lawyer continued, you have a court date. The judge assigned to your case. He hesitated. Bobby frowned. What? What is it? The lawyer sighed. You're not going to like this. He pulled out a photo from the file and placed it on the table. Bobby's breath caught in his throat. It was him, the black man in the suit, the one who recorded him, the one who didn't back down. And now, he was the judge. Bobby's hands started to shake. No, no way. This has to be a mistake. The lawyer leaned back in his chair. It's no mistake. Judge Malcolm Reeves. And trust me, he remembers you. Bobby felt like he was going to be sick. Judge. A judge. The same man he had tried to humiliate on the side of the road was now the one who held his fate in his hands. His lawyer's voice cut through the panic swirling in his head. You better pray for mercy, he said, because this time you don't have the power. Days passed in a blur of dread and sleepless nights. The morning of his hearing arrived faster than he wanted it to. He was led into the courtroom, his wrists still cuffed. The place was packed. Reporters, lawyers, spectators. Bobby tried not to look at them. Then, the bailiff spoke. All rise for the Honorable Judge Malcolm Reeves. Bobby's heart pounded as the man he had harassed on the highway walked into the courtroom, black robes flowing behind him. He took his seat at the bench, his expression unreadable. Bobby looked away, feeling a fresh wave of panic crawl up his spine. This was worse than he had ever imagined. The judge cleared his throat. Let's begin. Bobby barely heard the opening statements. His mind was spinning. He had never expected to end up here. And the worst part? Judge Reeves hadn't even looked at him yet. It was like he didn't even exist. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge lifted his gaze, locking eyes with Bobby for the first time since that fateful day on the road. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, but his words sent a chill down Bobby's spine. Tell me, Mr. Larson, the judge said, do you believe in justice? Bobby swallowed. He didn't know how to answer, because for the first time in his life, he was about to find out what justice really meant. Bobby's throat felt like sandpaper. His hands, cuffed and clammy, gripped the edge of the table. The courtroom was silent, so silent that he could hear the rapid thudding of his own heartbeat. Judge Malcolm Reeves, the man he had mocked, harassed, and tried to intimidate on the side of the road, sat high above him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating. He was just watching, waiting. Mr. Larson, Judge Reeves repeated, his voice as steady as ever. Do you believe in justice? Bobby opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His lawyer nudged him slightly. Answer the judge, he whispered. Bobby swallowed hard. Why, yes, he croaked. The judge tilted his head slightly, as if he was examining him. Interesting, he said, because from what I've read in this case, you seem to believe in something else entirely. Power, control, and fear. Bobby clenched his fists. His mind screamed at him to say something, to defend himself. I didn't mean. You didn't mean to impersonate a police officer? Judge Reeves cut him off. You didn't mean to harass innocent people? You didn't mean to abuse your fake authority? Bobby's mouth opened, then closed. There was no right answer. No escape. The judge leaned back in his chair. Let's review some of your actions, shall we? A court officer stepped forward, placing a file in front of the judge. He flipped it open. Incident number 1. Pulling over a young woman, demanding her number in exchange for letting her off a made-up fine. Bobby stiffened. Incident number 2. Threatening a Latino father driving his sick child to the hospital, telling him that if he didn't pay an on-the-spot fine, he'd have immigration called on him. Bobby's breathing grew shallow. Incident number 3. Harassing an elderly black man, calling him boy and telling him to stay in his place before issuing him a fake speeding ticket. The judge's voice was calm, controlled, but Bobby could hear the disgust underneath it. Judge Reeves closed the file. The courtroom was deadly silent. Now, tell me, Mr. Larson, the judge said, finally locking eyes with him again. Do you still believe in justice? Bobby was shaking now. His lawyer stood up. Your Honor, my client is willing to accept responsibility for his actions, but we ask the court for leniency. Judge Reeves held up a hand. and the lawyer immediately fell silent. Responsibility, the judge said, his eyebrows rising. Mr. Larson, do you even know the meaning of that word? Bobby bit his lip. His entire body was tense. Then, Judge Reeves did something that sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He leaned forward. I remember you, Larson, he said softly. A chill ran down Bobby's spine. I remember how you looked at me on that highway, the judge continued. I remember the smugness in your voice, the arrogance in your stance. You thought you were untouchable. Bobby's chest was heaving now. But here's the thing about justice, the judge said, his voice still eerily calm. It catches up to everyone, even you. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Bobby's lawyer stood again, shifting nervously. Your Honor, we would like to request bail for Mr. Larson while we prepare his defense. Judge Reeves turned a page in the file, then looked back up. Bail is denied. Bobby's stomach dropped. His lawyer flinched. Your Honor, with all due respect. With all due respect, Judge Reeves interrupted, Mr. Larson is a danger to the public. He has spent months pretending to be a law enforcement officer, abusing his false authority, and instilling fear in innocent people. I see no reason to grant him temporary freedom while we determine his final sentence. Bobby's hands gripped the table, his nails digging into the wood. No bail. That meant he wasn't going home. That meant jail. The judge tapped his gavel once. This court is adjourned until the sentencing hearing next week, he announced. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Bobby felt his world spinning. He barely registered the bailiffs grabbing him, lifting him to his feet. Judge Reeves stood, adjusting his robe. He glanced at Bobby one last time before stepping away from the bench, and for the first time, Bobby saw something in his eyes. Not hatred, not revenge, something worse. Disappointment. Like Bobby wasn't even worth his anger. Like he was nothing. The bailiffs dragged him away, his mind racing, his body trembling. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to happen. But it was. And it was only going to get worse. The holding cell was cold, dark, smelled of sweat and regret. Bobby sat on the metal bench, his hands still shaking. The other inmates barely looked at him. He barely moved. No bail. No freedom. 1 week. 1 week until his sentencing. 1 week until he found out just how much his past was going to cost him. He closed his eyes. And for the first time in his life, Bobby Larson was truly afraid. Bobby barely slept. The cold walls of the holding cell pressed in on him, the air thick with sweat and the stale stench of fear. He was no stranger to fear. He had used it like a weapon, throwing it at others to make them bend, to make them break. But now, he was the one breaking. The minutes stretched into hours. The hours stretched into days. Every morning, he woke up hoping that this was all a nightmare. That somehow, he'd open his eyes and be back in his car, flashing his fake badge, barking orders, and feeling like a king on the streets. But every morning, reality hit him harder. He was no king. He was just another criminal in a cell. Then came the worst part. The other inmates started to recognize him. Hey, ain't you that fake cop on the news? One of them sneered, a tattooed man with a scar running down his cheek. Bobby swallowed. I don't know what you're talking about. The man chuckled, nudging the guy next to him. You hear that? He don't know what we talking about. Another inmate, a tall, bald man with arms like tree trunks, leaned against the bars. So you like locking people up, huh? You like throwing your weight around? His voice was calm, too calm. Bobby looked away. I wasn't locking anyone up. Yeah. The scarred man smirked. You just pretended to be a cop. Fake badge. Fake tickets. Fake power. He laughed, shaking his head. Pathetic. Bobby felt his heart hammering in his chest. He had no power here. No car to speed off in. No fake authority to hide behind. Here, he was just another inmate. And they were starting to enjoy watching him squirm. By the 5th day, Bobby's nerves were completely shot. He barely ate, barely spoke. Every noise made him flinch. Then, just as he was beginning to think it couldn't get worse, it did. A guard rapped on the bars. Larson, you got a visitor. Bobby blinked. A visitor? His first thought was his lawyer. Maybe there was some news. Maybe they had found a way to get him out of this mess. The guard led him to a small, dimly lit room. A single chair, a scratched-up table, and a man waiting on the other side of the glass. Bobby froze in the doorway. It wasn't his lawyer. It was Judge Malcolm Reeves. His stomach twisted into a knot. The judge sat with his fingers steepled together, his dark brown eyes calm. Studying Bobby. Bobby forced himself to move forward, his knees weak. He sat down, swallowing hard. The judge didn't speak at first. He just watched him. Bobby shifted uncomfortably. What are you doing here? Judge Reeves finally leaned forward, his voice steady. I wanted to see something for myself. Bobby frowned. See what? The judge tilted his head slightly. If you've learned anything. Bobby clenched his jaw. I didn't do anything that bad. A silence stretched between them. Then, the judge let out a small sigh, shaking his head. That's the problem, Larson. You still don't get it. Bobby's hands curled into fists. I didn't kill anyone. I didn't beat anyone up. I just wanted respect. Judge Reeves lifted an eyebrow. Respect? He let out a small, humorless chuckle. No, you wanted fear. And you got it, didn't you? You got to watch people squirm. You got to feel big. Bobby looked away. The judge's voice dropped slightly, his tone harder now. Tell me something, Larson. When you pulled me over that day, what did you see? Bobby frowned. What kind of question is that? What did you see? The judge repeated, his gaze sharp. Bobby licked his dry lips. I don't know. Some guy in a fancy suit. A guy who thought he was better than me. Judge Reeves leaned back in his chair. And that made you angry, didn't it? Bobby swallowed. The judge studied him for a long moment. You want to know what I saw that day? Bobby hesitated. What? I saw a man who was desperate to be something he wasn't, Judge Reeves said simply. Bobby's fingers twitched. I saw a man so terrified of being powerless that he built himself a fake world where he was in control, the judge continued. A man so lost in his own fear that he had to take it out on others. Bobby's throat tightened. You weren't just pretending to be a cop, Larson, the judge said. You were pretending to be a man. The words sliced through Bobby like a knife. His hands gripped the edge of the table. His vision blurred. The judge exhaled slowly, watching him. I came here because I needed to know if there was anything in you worth saving. If there was any part of you that could actually change. Bobby's breath was shaky. And, what do you think? The judge studied him for another long moment. Then he stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. I guess we'll find out at your sentencing. Bobby's stomach dropped. Wait. But the judge was already walking away, the doors swinging shut behind him. Bobby sat there, his fists trembling, his mind spinning. For the first time in his life, he didn't know if he could get out of this one, and that terrified him. The day of sentencing arrived faster than Bobby had expected. He sat in the courtroom, his wrists cuffed, his suit wrinkled from hours in the holding cell. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through legal papers, but Bobby barely heard anything he said. His mind was trapped in a loop of dread, each second tightening around him like a noose. The judge had visited him. Judge Reeves had visited him. He had looked Bobby in the eyes and told him that his entire life, everything he had built, every fake moment of control, was nothing but a lie. And the worst part? Bobby couldn't argue with him. Now, here he was, waiting to hear the exact price of his lies. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension in the room. All rise for the Honorable Judge Malcolm Reeves. The courtroom stood as Judge Reeves entered, his black robe flowing behind him. His face was unreadable, calm but firm, as he took his seat. You may be seated, he said. Bobby dropped into his chair, his knees weak. He swallowed the lump in his throat as the judge glanced at the files before him. Mr. Larson, Judge Reeves began, his voice steady. You stand before this court convicted of multiple counts of impersonating a police officer, fraud, and harassment. You used deception to exploit vulnerable people, taking advantage of fear for your own gain. You built your life on intimidation. Bobby clenched his jaw. The judge lifted his eyes. But now, that life has caught up to you. A murmur rippled through the spectators in the courtroom. Judge Reeves continued, flipping to another page. Before I announce my sentence, I have reviewed the statements from your victims. I have listened to the pain you have caused them. Many of them feared real law enforcement because of what you did. They lost trust in the justice system because of you. Bobby's throat felt tight. He hadn't thought about it that way before. The judge paused. However, I have also reviewed your background, Mr. Larson. No prior record. No history of violent crime. And despite your actions, I have seen that you are not beyond redemption. Bobby's lawyer straightened slightly, sensing a sliver of hope. Judge Reeves exhaled. Therefore, this court sentences you to 5 years in prison. Bobby's stomach plummeted, but suspends 2 years under strict conditions. A hushed whisper spread through the room. Bobby's lawyer perked up. Your Honor, may I ask what conditions? The judge nodded. Mr. Larson will serve 3 years in a state correctional facility. Upon release, he will enter a mandatory rehabilitation program, including community service designed to educate him on the realities of policing, racial bias, and abuse of authority. He will work under the supervision of real officers, learning firsthand what justice truly means. Bobby's jaw clenched. Community service? Working with real cops? This wasn't just about punishment. This was about change. Judge Reeves leaned forward slightly. And, Mr. Larson, if you violate these conditions at any point, the full 5-year sentence will be reinstated immediately. Bobby swallowed. This wasn't just jail time. This was a lesson. Judge Reeves tapped his gavel. Court is adjourned. The sound echoed through the room, final and unshakable. Bobby slumped back in his chair, his mind spinning. 3 years in prison. Then years of facing the very system he had mocked. He had spent his life pretending to be a cop. Now, he was going to learn what it really meant to serve. As the bailiffs led him away, Bobby glanced back at the judge one last time. Judge Reeves didn't smirk, didn't gloat. He simply nodded. A silent message. Learn, change, or be lost forever. Bobby didn't know if he could, but for the first time, he wanted to try. The prison gates clanged shut behind Bobby, the sound ringing in his ears like a final judgment. 3 years. 3 years locked away in a place where he had no fake badge, no fake authority, and no control. He followed the guard down the long, dimly lit hallway, his stomach twisting. The walls were gray and cold, covered in scratches and marks from the ghosts of inmates before him. The air was thick with the scent of sweat and disinfectant. He had seen prisons before, on TV, in the movies. He had threatened people with them when he played fake cop. But now? Now he was in one. Step inside, the guard barked, unlocking a cell door. Bobby hesitated. Inside, a man with a thick beard and broad shoulders sat on the bottom bunk. His dark eyes locked on Bobby the moment he entered. Welcome to hell, the man muttered. The cell door slammed shut behind Bobby. And just like that, his new reality began. The first few days were worse than anything Bobby had ever experienced. The guards barely looked at him. The inmates either ignored him or stared at him like he was fresh meat. He was used to being in control. Now, he was nothing. His first real wake-up call came during lunch on his 4th day. He was standing in line, gripping his tray, when a tall, muscular man with tattoos creeping up his neck stepped beside him. You the fake cop? The man asked, his voice low but dangerous. Bobby stiffened. Word had spread fast. He swallowed hard. I don't want any trouble. The man smirked. Trouble? Oh, you had no problem giving people trouble when you were out there flashing that fake badge, did you? Bobby's grip tightened on his tray. The man grabbed his shoulder, shoving him forward. Now you gonna see what it feels like to be on the other side. Bobby's heart pounded. Before he could react, another voice cut through the tension. Let him go. Bobby turned. A stocky man with a shaved head and deep scars on his arms was staring at them. His tone was calm, but there was something solid in his presence, something that made the tattooed man hesitate. The taller man sneered. This ain't your business, Reese. It is now. The stocky man, Reese said. He's not worth it. Tattoo Neck clicked his tongue in annoyance, but finally let go of Bobby. Bobby exhaled shakily. Reese looked at him. You're lucky. Bobby frowned. Lucky? Reese nodded. Yeah, because right now, nobody knows what to do with you. They don't know if you're a fraud or just another inmate. Bobby clenched his jaw. I am just another inmate. Reese chuckled. Not to them. To them, you're either a joke or a target. Bobby swallowed hard. Reese leaned in slightly. You want to survive here? Keep your head down. Don't act like you're better than anyone. And learn. Learn what? Bobby asked. Reese gave him a long look. What it feels like. Then he walked away, leaving Bobby standing there, gripping his tray like it was his last lifeline. Days turned into weeks. Prison wasn't just about surviving fights or avoiding the wrong people. It was mental. It chipped away at him, day by day. He wasn't Bobby Larson, fake cop anymore. He was just Bobby, inmate number 41257. No power. No control. Nothing. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be small, and it terrified him. One day, after a particularly rough morning, Bobby sat on his bunk, staring at the gray wall. Reese sat across from him, watching him. You ever wonder why you did it? Reese asked. Bobby frowned. Did what? Played cop. Pulled people over. Harassed them. Reese leaned forward. Was it fun? Did it make you feel strong? Bobby clenched his jaw. I don't know. Yes, you do. Bobby exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. I just wanted respect. Reese scoffed. Nah, you wanted fear. Bobby looked away. Reese nodded to himself. You know, real cops? The ones who actually care? They don't want fear. They want order. They want justice. He stared at Bobby. You? You wanted to feel big. And now look at you. Bobby's fist clenched. You think I don't know that? He snapped. Reese didn't flinch. I think you just figured it out. Bobby breathed hard, his chest rising and falling. He hated this. He hated himself. And the worst part? Reese was right. Months passed. Something in Bobby started to change. The anger? The arrogance? It started to fade. He began watching the other inmates. He saw how some of them had stories, real stories. Men who had been wrongfully arrested. Men who had made mistakes but never had a chance. Men he had mocked when he was out there playing cop. And for the first time, Bobby started to feel something he had never truly felt before. Guilt. Not just guilt for getting caught, but guilt for what he had done. It gnawed at him, kept him awake at night. Reese noticed. You finally seeing it, huh? He asked one evening. Bobby hesitated. Seeing what? The damage you did. Bobby stared at the ceiling. Yeah. Reese nodded. Good. Now the real question is, what are you going to do about it? Bobby didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time, he wanted one. Bobby stared at the ceiling of his cell, his mind racing. What was he going to do about it? The guilt had settled in like an unwelcome guest, refusing to leave. He had spent his life taking power where he could, stepping on people to feel taller. But now, stripped of everything, he finally saw what he had been too blind to see before. He had hurt people, real people, and no fake badge, no fake authority could erase that. But was it too late to change? Weeks turned into months, and Bobby's time inside became a cycle of routine and silence. For the first time, he wasn't trying to control others. He was listening. He listened to stories from men who had been dealt bad hands in life. Some were guilty of their crimes, but some had been thrown into the system with no way out. He thought back to all the people he had pulled over, the way they had looked at him with fear, the way he had fed off it. He had thought they were weak, but now he saw it differently. They weren't weak. They were tired. Tired of being judged. Tired of being punished for things that weren't crimes. Tired of being afraid. And he had been part of that. One day, during yard time, Bobby sat on a bench, watching the other inmates. Reese sat down next to him. You look like a man with a lot on his mind. Bobby sighed. I don't know how to fix it. Reese smirked. Fix what? Your sentence? Bobby shook his head. Me. Reese's smirk faded. He leaned back, arms crossed. Most guys in here don't care about fixing themselves. They just want to survive. He glanced at Bobby. But you? You got a shot at something else. Bobby frowned. What do you mean? You got a second chance, Larson. Judge could have thrown you away for a long time, but he didn't. You ever ask yourself why? Bobby had asked himself that question 100 times. Why had Judge Reeves given him a chance? Why hadn't he just made an example out of him? Reese leaned forward. Because he thinks you can change. Now, the question is, do you? Bobby didn't have an answer. Not yet. Months later, the day finally came. Release day. Bobby stood in front of the prison gates, his heart pounding. He had thought this moment would feel like freedom, like relief. Instead, he felt something else. Uncertainty. He had no idea who he was anymore. A car pulled up, and his lawyer stepped out. Let's go, Larson. You've got a long road ahead of you. Bobby took a deep breath and stepped forward. The prison gates slammed shut behind him. He was free, but his sentence wasn't over. Now, he had to face the world. And somehow, make things right. The air outside felt different. Bobby had imagined this moment for months. The day he would step out of prison, breathe fresh air, and feel free. But now that he was here, standing on the sidewalk in clothes that no longer felt like his own, he realized something. He wasn't free. Not really. His real sentence was just beginning. The car ride was silent. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through paperwork, but Bobby barely heard anything. The world outside looked different, brighter, sharper, like he had been seeing everything through a dirty lens before. He had spent 3 years locked up, and now, he had to step into a life that didn't belong to him anymore. Where are we going? He finally asked. His lawyer glanced at him. Judge Reeves arranged a meeting for you. Bobby's stomach twisted. The judge. The man he had humiliated. The man who had punished him. The man who had given him a second chance. The car pulled up to a quiet, professional-looking building. Bobby's hands felt clammy as he stepped out, walking through the doors. Inside, Judge Reeves sat behind a desk, waiting. Bobby froze. The judge looked the same as he had in court, calm, collected, unreadable. But there was something different now, something Bobby couldn't quite place. Sit down, Mr. Larson, the judge said. Bobby swallowed and obeyed. Judge Reeves leaned forward. Do you know why you're here? Bobby hesitated. To start my probation? The judge nodded. Yes. And to begin the real part of your sentence. Bobby shifted uncomfortably. I already did 3 years. What more do you want from me? The judge's eyes locked onto his. I want you to learn. Bobby clenched his fists. Learn what? Judge Reeves didn't blink. What it means to be on the other side. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, the judge reached into a folder and pulled out a piece of paper. He slid it across the table. Bobby frowned and picked it up. His eyes widened. Community service, he muttered. Not just any community service. Judge Reeves corrected. You will be working alongside real officers. Helping real victims. Seeing the damage you caused from a different angle. Bobby swallowed hard. And if I refuse? The judge's voice was cool. Then you go back to prison and serve the remaining 2 years of your sentence. Bobby felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. This wasn't just about serving time. This was about facing what he had done. The judge folded his hands. Your choice, Mr. Larson. Bobby stared down at the paper. His hands trembled. And for the first time in his life, he made the right one. I'll do it. Judge Reeves nodded. Then let's begin. Bobby didn't know what to expect on his first day. He was assigned to a community outreach program, a department that worked directly with victims of police misconduct, abuse, and wrongful accusations. It was ironic, poetic, even. The same system he had pretended to be part of was now forcing him to see exactly what he had done to people. His supervisor was a no-nonsense officer named Sergeant Daniels, a broad-shouldered black man with a deep voice and eyes that seemed to see everything. You work for me now, Daniels said, handing Bobby a clipboard. No attitude. No shortcuts. You do exactly what I tell you, or you go back inside. Understood? Bobby nodded quickly. Daniels studied him. You ever actually listened to someone who needed help before? Bobby hesitated. Daniels smirked. Yeah, didn't think so. Bobby clenched his jaw, but he stayed silent. His first task? Paperwork. Hours and hours of it. Filing complaints, organizing cases, reading reports from real victims. At first, it was just words on a page. But then, it started to sink in. One file was about a young woman who had been pulled over by an actual corrupt officer, threatened, and forced to pay cash or face arrest. Another was about an elderly man wrongfully detained and humiliated in front of his grandchildren. Story after story, case after case. They weren't just files. They were people. People who had felt the same fear Bobby had made people feel. For the first time, he felt sick. Not because he was in trouble, but because he finally understood. Days turned into weeks. Bobby's assignments became more hands-on. He sat in community meetings, listening as people talked about their fear of law enforcement, their anger, their pain. He helped officers deliver food and aid to struggling families. Families who had been failed by the same system he had pretended to uphold. It was exhausting, humiliating, but strangely, it felt right. One evening, after a long day, Sergeant Daniels pulled him aside. "You're not the same guy who walked in here a month ago," he said. Bobby scoffed. "Yeah, well, prison will do that to you." Daniels shook his head. "Nah, I've seen guys do time and come out worse. But you? You're actually paying attention." Bobby didn't know what to say. Daniels studied him. "You can't change the past, Larson, but you can decide what kind of man you're gonna be moving forward." Bobby nodded slowly. For the first time in his life, he actually wanted to be better. But just when Bobby thought he was starting to understand the path ahead, life threw him one last test. One evening, he was closing up the outreach office when he heard shouting outside. He stepped onto the sidewalk and saw a heated argument between a police officer and a black teenager. The officer's hand was on his holster. The teen's fists were clenched. The tension was thick. One wrong move, and it could go bad, fast. Bobby's heart pounded. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one causing fear. He was watching it, and he had a choice. Stay out of it, or step in and try to stop the cycle. Bobby took a deep breath. Then he made his decision. He stepped forward. Bobby's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his hands open, his mind racing. The officer, a young, tense-looking cop with a tight grip on his holster, was inches away from the black teenager, whose chest was rising and falling in quick, sharp breaths. Bobby had seen moments like this before, but back then, he was the one causing the tension. Now he had to stop it. "Hey," Bobby said, his voice steady but firm. "What's going on here?" The officer snapped his head toward him, his eyes narrowing. "Step back. This doesn't concern you." Bobby ignored the command. "I work with the community outreach program," he said quickly, flashing his ID badge. "Let's just talk before things escalate." The teenager, probably no older than 17, looked furious. But beneath the anger, Bobby saw something else. Fear. It was the same fear Bobby had ignored for years. The officer hesitated. His hand was still too close to his gun. Bobby took a slow breath. "Come on, man," he said, keeping his tone calm. What's he even being stopped for? The officer's jaw tightened. He was loitering. Gave me attitude when I asked him to move. Bobby turned to the teen. "That true?" The kid looked like he wanted to spit fire, but he gritted his teeth and nodded. "Yeah, I was standing outside the store, waiting for my friend. He came up talking about how I look suspicious. I told him I wasn't doing anything wrong." Bobby exhaled. He turned back to the cop. "Look, man, is this really worth it? The kid's just standing outside a store. There's no crime in that." The officer's fingers twitched near his holster. He was aggressive. "No," Bobby cut in. "He was defensive. Because he thought you were going to treat him like a criminal before he even did anything." The officer's face twisted, but Bobby didn't let up. "Look, I get it. You're on edge. You want to feel in control." His own words hit him like a gut punch. "But this isn't control. It's just fear." The officer hesitated. His grip on his holster loosened. Bobby saw the moment the tension broke. The officer sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Fine, kid, just go home." The teenager's shoulders relaxed slightly, though he still looked wary. Bobby nodded at him. "You good?" The teen eyed the officer, then Bobby. "Yeah." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The officer shook his head and gave Bobby one last glance before stepping back to his squad car. He muttered something under his breath before driving off. Bobby let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. His hands were shaking. For the first time in his life, he had been on the other side of it. For the first time, he had stopped what he used to do. Back at the outreach center, Bobby sat on the worn-out couch, his mind replaying what had just happened. Sergeant Daniels walked in, raising an eyebrow. "Heard you stepped in tonight." Bobby nodded slowly. "Yeah." Daniels sat down across from him. "How'd it feel?" Bobby let out a bitter laugh. "Weird. Like I was looking at my old self in that cop." Daniels studied him. "And?" Bobby exhaled. "And I hated it." Daniels nodded. "Good." Bobby looked up. "Good." Daniels leaned forward. "That means you're not him anymore." Bobby swallowed hard. For so long, he had been running from who he used to be. But tonight, for the first time, he had done something different. And it felt right. Daniels clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Get some rest, Larson. You did good today." Bobby nodded, though his mind was still spinning. For the first time in his life, he didn't just feel like someone pretending to be in control. He felt like someone trying to do the right thing. Maybe, just maybe, he could be more than the man he used to be. The next morning, Bobby woke up feeling different. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was suffocating under the weight of his past. The moment outside the store, stopping that officer from escalating the situation, had changed something inside him. It wasn't redemption. He knew that wasn't something you could earn in a single night. But it was a start. As he walked into the outreach center, Sergeant Daniels was already at his desk, sipping his coffee. He looked up as Bobby entered. "You're late," he said. Bobby checked the clock. "It's 8:02. Daniels smirked. "Exactly," Bobby sighed, shaking his head as he grabbed a folder from the desk. But before he could open it, Daniels spoke again. "You're coming with me today," he said. Bobby frowned. "Where?" Daniels stood up, grabbing his jacket. "We're going into the neighborhoods. Time for you to see firsthand what real police work looks like." Bobby's stomach tightened. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but deep down, he knew this was exactly what he needed. They drove through the city streets, past places Bobby had never really paid attention to before. Poor neighborhoods, run-down apartment buildings, schools with broken windows, places where the police weren't seen as protectors. Bobby had never seen these people before, not really. But now, as Daniels parked the car and they stepped out onto a sidewalk lined with cracked pavement and graffiti-covered walls, Bobby felt something strange. He wanted to understand. Daniels led him to a small community center where a group of teenagers was gathered outside. Some of them looked up warily as the two men approached. "Hey, Mr. D," one of the kids called out. "Who's the new guy?" Daniels nodded toward Bobby. "This is Larson. He's learning." A skinny teenager with sharp eyes crossed his arms. "Learning what?" Bobby hesitated. Daniels glanced at him. Bobby took a slow breath. "How to be better than I was," he said honestly. The teens exchanged glances. One of them, a girl with braids and a skeptical expression, scoffed. "Yeah? And what were you before?" Bobby's throat tightened. He could lie. He could brush it off. But that wasn't what this was about. "I used to pretend to be a cop," he admitted. "Used it to scare people. Control them." The group went silent. The girl raised an eyebrow. "So, you were a fake cop, and now you're here trying to act all changed?" Bobby exhaled. "I'm not acting. I know I messed up. I hurt people. I can't change what I did." He paused. "But I can learn from it. And I can do better now." Silence. Then, one of the boys, a tall kid with a nervous energy, spoke. "You ever pull over someone who didn't deserve it?" Bobby's chest tightened. He thought of Judge Reeves. He thought of the father rushing his sick child to the hospital. The woman he had tried to intimidate. "Yeah," Bobby admitted. "A lot of people." The kid nodded slowly, looking away. "My uncle got stopped by a cop for nothing. Got locked up for resisting when he wasn't even doing anything." Bobby clenched his fists. That sounded exactly like the kind of thing he had done. And now, he was standing face to face with someone who had been hurt by the system he had helped break. Daniels placed a hand on Bobby's shoulder. "This is why we're here, Larson. To listen. To learn." Bobby nodded, his throat tight. He had spent so much time running from his past. But now, for the first time, He wasn't running anymore. He was facing it. The next few weeks were different. Bobby spent more time in the community, talking to people, hearing their stories. He sat in on town hall meetings, watching as people poured out their frustrations with law enforcement. He even met victims of fake policing, people who had been targeted by men just like him. Every story felt like another brick on his back. But instead of breaking him, it was building something new. One evening, he was sitting outside the outreach center when Sergeant Daniels joined him. "You know, Larson," Daniels said, sipping his coffee, "most guys like you never change." Bobby looked up. "Yeah." Daniels nodded. "But you? You're different." Bobby scoffed. "I don't feel different." Daniels chuckled. "That's how you know you are." Bobby exhaled. "You really think I can fix what I did?" Daniels shook his head. "No. But you can make sure it never happens again." Bobby nodded slowly. That was enough. For now. But then, just when he thought he was making progress, his past came knocking. One evening, Bobby was walking home from the outreach center when he noticed something. A car. A black sedan parked across the street. At first, he thought nothing of it. But when he turned the corner, he saw it again, slowly rolling up behind him. Bobby's stomach twisted. Was someone following him? He quickened his pace, his mind racing. He had made enemies in prison. Could it be one of them? Or was it someone from his past? Then, just as he was about to turn onto his street, the car pulled up beside him. The window rolled down. Bobby's breath caught in his throat. Sitting in the driver's seat was a face he never expected to see again. The same face he had seen that night in prison. The same man who had nearly beaten him during his first week inside. Tattoo neck. He smirked. "Hey, fake cop. Miss me?" Bobby's pulse spiked. His past wasn't just haunting him. It had found him. And it wasn't done yet. Bobby's breath hitched in his throat. Tattoo neck. The last time he had seen this man was in prison, where he had barely escaped a beating. And now, here he was, rolling up in a car like a ghost from Bobby's past. "Didn't think I'd see you again, did you?" Tattoo neck smirked, resting an arm on the window frame. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that came before something bad. Bobby's body went rigid. His mind screamed at him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He swallowed hard. "What do you want?" Tattoo neck chuckled, shaking his head. "Relax, man. I ain't here to fight. I just heard you were out. Thought I'd check in." Bobby didn't believe that for a second. Tattoo neck had been one of the most dangerous guys inside. He ran with the kind of people who didn't just let things go. And Bobby? Bobby had been an easy target back then. So why was he here now? Tattoo neck's eyes flicked over him, like he was sizing him up. "You changed, huh? Got yourself a nice little gig with the community and all that?" Bobby's fist clenched. "Yeah, I changed." Tattoo neck smirked. "See, that's funny. 'Cause people like you, they don't change. They just find a new way to play the game." Bobby's jaw tightened. "I ain't playing anymore," he said firmly. Tattoo neck leaned closer, his smirk fading slightly. "Yeah? We'll see about that." Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Tattoo neck rolled up his window and drove off. Bobby stood there, his heart still hammering. That wasn't just a check-in. It was a warning. And Bobby had a bad feeling his past wasn't done with him yet. The next day at the outreach center, Bobby couldn't focus. Daniels noticed. "You look like a man with a problem," he said, watching Bobby closely. Bobby exhaled, rubbing his face. "Someone from my past showed up last night." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Someone from inside?" Bobby nodded. Daniels didn't ask who. He didn't need to. "You tell me what this guy wants?" Bobby hesitated. "Not yet. But I don't think he's done." Daniels leaned back, crossing his arms. "Listen, Larson. You're trying to turn your life around. But that past of yours? It don't disappear just because you're doing the right thing now." Bobby ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I figured that out." Daniels leaned forward. "You got two choices. You let this guy pull you back in, or you keep walking forward." Bobby exhaled. "And what if he doesn't let me walk away?" Daniel's eyes darkened slightly. "Then you make him understand that you're not the same weak man he remembers." Bobby nodded slowly. Easier said than done. That night, Bobby kept his head on a swivel. He took a different route home, his senses sharp. But nothing happened. No car. No sign of Tattoo Neck. Maybe it was just mind games. Maybe Tattoo Neck just wanted to rattle him. But deep down, Bobby knew better. This wasn't over. And he was right. Because the next day, when Bobby arrived at the outreach center, he found the doors slightly open. His stomach dropped. Cautiously, he stepped inside. The office was trashed. Papers scattered. Chairs overturned. Someone had been here, and they had left a message. Scrawled across the whiteboard in thick, black marker were 3 words. You still owe. Bobby's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a threat. Tattoo Neck wanted something. And Bobby had a feeling he knew exactly what it was. His past wasn't just knocking anymore. It had kicked the door wide open. And Bobby was running out of time. Bobby stared at the words on the whiteboard, his pulse hammering in his ears. You still owe. Tattoo Neck wasn't just playing games. He was making it clear that Bobby's past wasn't done with him. But what did he owe? He had no debts, no unfinished business in prison. Unless Tattoo Neck wasn't after money. Unless he wanted something else. Footsteps sounded behind him. Bobby spun around, fists clenched, but it was just Sergeant Daniels. His sharp eyes swept over the room, his expression darkening. Well, hell, Daniels muttered. Guess your past ain't done with you yet. Bobby exhaled. Nope. Daniels crossed his arms. You gonna tell me who did this? Bobby hesitated. Could he? Should he? Snitching in prison meant death. But out here, it meant protection. And right now, Bobby needed all the protection he could get. It was a guy from inside, he admitted. Tattoo Neck. Daniel's expression didn't change. What does he want? Bobby shook his head. Not sure. But I have a feeling it's not good. Daniels studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right. You got 2 choices, Larson. You can wait for this guy to make the next move and pray it don't cost you everything. Or you take control of the situation. Bobby scoffed. And how do I do that? Go knocking on his door and ask nicely? Daniels smirked. Not exactly. 2 hours later, Bobby sat in an empty diner, staring at the entrance. He had sent a message to one of his old prison contacts, someone who ran in the same circles as Tattoo Neck. The plan was simple. Get answers. A few minutes later, a man slid into the booth across from him. Didn't think I'd see you again, Larson, the man said, eyeing him. Bobby didn't have time for pleasantries. What does Tattoo Neck want? The man chuckled. Straight to the point. Huh? All right. He wants a favor. Bobby tensed. A favor? The man nodded. There's a job. A quick in and out. No guns, no blood. Just a simple robbery. And he wants you to be part of it. Bobby felt his stomach twist. He shook his head. No way. I'm not that guy anymore. The man smirked. Yeah? Try telling that to him. He thinks you owe him for keeping you alive inside. And if you don't pay up? The smirk faded. Let's just say he knows where you sleep. Bobby clenched his fists. He was being dragged back in. No, he wasn't. He had fought too hard, come too far. He wasn't going back. He stood up. Tell him I'm out. And if he comes near me again. The man raised an eyebrow. You'll do what? Bobby hesitated. Then he exhaled. I'll make sure he never gets another chance. The man studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. I'll let him know. Bobby watched as the man left the diner, disappearing into the night. He had made his choice, and he knew Tattoo Neck wouldn't like it. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. A week passed. No calls. No messages. No threats. Bobby was starting to think maybe, just maybe, Tattoo Neck had let it go. Then, one night, as he was locking up the outreach center, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Tattoo Neck stood in the alley, smirking. You made the wrong choice, Larson. Bobby squared his shoulders. No, I made the only choice. Tattoo Neck's smirk faded. His hands clenched into fists. You think you're better than me now? Bobby didn't blink. No, I think I'm better than I used to be. Tattoo Neck took a slow step forward. You still think you can walk away from this? Bobby's voice was steady. Yeah. Tattoo Neck stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Bobby let out a slow breath. It was over. For the first time in his life, Bobby Larson had chosen the right path. And this time, he was never looking back. 1 year later, Bobby stood in front of a small classroom, a room full of young kids staring up at him. He took a deep breath. "My name is Bobby Larson," he said, "and I used to be the wrong kind of man." The kids watched him, listening. "But I changed. And if I can change, anyone can." In the back of the room, Judge Reeves stood with Sergeant Daniels, watching. Bobby met the judge's eyes. Judge Reeves nodded once, just slightly. A silent message. "You did good." Bobby nodded back. For the first time in his life, he finally understood what real justice looked like. And it had nothing to do with fear. It had everything to do with redemption.